as we looked to the new format and what should we get rid of and what should we keep, one of the first things everybody came back to us with, keep the year in review. Now, I think it was because they really couldn't care less about the material that would come up, more they just wanted to see Mark. But anyway, Mark, welcome back, and the podium is yours.
Okay, great. Okay, so good morning, everyone. You're also supposed to say good morning. Good morning. There you go. All right. I'll try to keep some of the energy going. The setting that we have here is one in which I suspect there'll be some coming and going of people. So it's already started. So what I think I'm going to do is proceed in a way that's a bit more of a storytelling than necessarily a distillation of what happened over the past year. And in part, that's not all that necessary to offer a distillation or a survey, because, for example, on the prosecutors panel yesterday, I thought we caught a marvelous snapshots of all of the work that the international tribunals have been doing in terms of ongoing cases, new investigations, and also issues such as sentencing and enforcement. And I also thought what was really fascinating in the prosecutors panel was a presentation also of some of the very important developments at the national level in terms of both new kinds of prosecutions. So that it was fascinating that corruption is emerging as a penal sanction to map onto an atrocity context, and also a variety of conversations about universal jurisdiction. So what I think I'd like to do is actually tell three stories of three things that did happen in international criminal justice over the past year, but also use it as a vehicle and a doorway to think about law, but also how law fits in life. And one of the themes that I want to evoke through these stories is what I felt is an important vibe in international criminal law enforcement this past year, and it's the theme of time and age and coming of age. So let me start with the ICCC. So as had been mentioned yesterday, one of the convictions that was rendered in November of 2018 involved criminality and two defendants prosecuted and convicted for the second time with regards to what? With regards to genocide in Cambodia, with regards to crimes against humanity, and a broader spectrum of crimes against humanity. One of the defendants, Nguyen Chia, passed away on August 4th of 2019 after having been convicted twice by the ICCC on different sets of charges. He passed away at the age of 93 and had been ill for a while and has spent about the past decades in detention with regards to the ongoing prosecutorial attempts and success stories. And he was the chief ideologist, so to speak, of the Khmer Rouge regime. For those of you who may not necessarily be aware of all the details, Khmer Rouge, government of Democratic Kampuchea from 1975 to 1979, initiated a variety of horrific massacres, forced labor, starvation. Roughly 2 million Cambodians passed away in that time period. And after the Khmer Rouge left power, they were ousted by the Vietnamese army that invaded. And actually, very interestingly, a People's Tribunal was set up at that time that ended up prosecuting two defendants, one of whom at the time was Pol Pot, who passed away himself either by suicide or just through natural causes in 1998. When we look at the work of the ICCC, one aspect of it that I find fascinating is the reality of the prosecution of extremely elderly individuals. Among the major defendants that had been indicted, one is still alive, another is still alive, Deutsch, serving a sentence, Nuon Chia passed away again at the age of 93. And other individuals that had been indicted also have passed away, and also in one instance was found to suffer from dementia. So to me, this is a fascinating question with regards to delayed justice and time. And at what point is justice delayed? It's never justice denied. But at what point is the imagery of these extremely elderly defendants in the verdict that was given on November 2018, one of the two defendants at the time who's still alive? You have to stand when the verdict is read. And the act of him standing in court was only possible because he was supported by two sort of guards, one of whom hoisted him up by the back of his trousers. And I think one very interesting question for us as international lawyers is, what is the public imagery, what are the aesthetics publicly of prosecutions of individuals who can barely stand, can barely walk, who, Demjanjuk in Munich is a book written by Larry Douglas on the prosecutions of John Demjanjuk that occurred in Munich at the national level in Germany. At one point, he had to come into the courtroom lying flat on a board that then had to be tilted up in order to visualize the proceedings. It reminds me of The Silence of the Lambs, where Hannibal Lecter is on this board, right? And no, but those are these kinds of visuals. So I think one thing that's for us very interesting is this prosecution of the very aged, the infirm, the very physically weak, and what that signifies to the public at large. And a reason that I find it interesting is because from there I'll move to sort of the second thing that I would like to talk about is we have international criminal law enforcement now focusing on this very elderly age band, but also increasingly children and young people are becoming subjects and deeply involved as both protected classes, but also participants in a certain sense in the process of international criminal law and its particular enforcement. And here, of course, I think about the prosecution of individuals for crimes such as child soldiering, unlawful recruitment, use, and enlistment under the age of 15, and also a number of the conviction, for example, in June of this summer, which was talked about earlier at the ICC of Ntaganda, and among the charges for which convictions were issued, there were 18 counts, I think, in total, and a number of those charges involve crimes that relate to very young people, minors, so sexual slavery and also child soldiering. Also very interesting to go back, I think, to the context of the ECCC. One of the convictions that was issued in November 2018 is for forced marriage, which in Cambodia had been practiced in a way that was quite different on the ground than it had been practiced, for example, by the AFRC and RUF in Sierra Leone, or by the Lord's Resistance Army, the LRA, in northern Uganda, which is the third trial that I would like to talk about, the proceedings with regards to Dominic Ongwen. I'll get to him in a bit. But what's fascinating to me in the forced marriage context, and we have Valerie Oosterveld here, who's probably, I think, the leading global authority on forced marriage as a crime in international criminal law. What's very interesting to me is how in Cambodia, the practices of forced marriage involved the state coming in, literally conscripting both men and women into conjugal unions. The Khmer Rouge did it in part to demolish the relevance of family and private loyalties, to fracture and fray associative rights, to allow the state to enter into the most private sphere of decision-making, and also in the ultimate paradox, killing 2 million people, but yet then wishing to bolster and increase the size of the Cambodian population to 20 million, and in part forced marriage turned into forced procreation. And then the ECCC criminalize that in terms of this particular verdict. In northern Uganda, the Ongwen case, so Dominic Ongwen's prosecution, the trial is ongoing. Who is he? He's the brigadier commander in the Lord's Resistance Army. He first entered the Lord's Resistance Army, it's unclear exactly when, but according to the defense, at the age of 9. He then grew up, so to speak, in the Lord's Resistance Army, became a child soldier, rose through the ranks, and achieves a level of great power within the spaces over which he had autonomy. Dominic Ongwen, I believe, is facing the largest number of charges that anyone has faced before an international tribunal. He's faced more charges than Milosevic had faced. I believe it's 70 charges, but you guys you're the numbers people on this, so am I right? Yeah. And he faces charges of crimes that he himself endured and suffers. Enslavement and, of course, child soldiering. Ongwen also faces charges for both his own personal status as someone who forcibly married women to himself, but also his responsibility for forced marriage within the Lord's Resistance Army as a whole. Now, forced marriage in northern Uganda was quite different than the way it was practiced in Cambodia. And the ICCC found in the Cambodian context that both men and women were the victims of forced marriage. In the Lord's Resistance Army case, and also in Sierra Leone, largely the portrayal of victimhood in forced marriage situations oriented itself around the women and girls. Not only in terms of the sexual slavery that happened within that context, which is actually a separate crime, but forced marriage being seen as similar conceptually as in the ICCC to forced associations, compelled conjugality. But in both northern Uganda, certainly how the prosecutor is bringing the case, which reflects what happened on the ground, and in Sierra Leone, there's a greater emphasis on the sexual slavery, the sexual torture, the mandated procreative aspect. So what I find very interesting to tie all this together is how this year, international criminal law, when I look at it, increasingly is involved in these life cycles of ordinary people in ordinary lives through the extraordinary criminality of these powerful defendants, certainly ones that become old through time, who look very frail and they flail. And also a story, for example, of someone like Dominic Ongwen, who began powerless, utterly powerless. And yet, through the metastasis of atrocity, he himself metastasized into, if you believe all the charges, he himself then, which obviously I would, right? He metastasized into someone who engaged in acts of terrible evil. And to me, these are these interesting questions of the etiology and the background, the provenance of atrocity, how to fully understand how atrocity becomes so massive in scope. It's good, I think, to have a conversation about Dominic Ongwen and his complex perpetrator, as a complex perpetrator. Because complex perpetrators are the actors and agents that make atrocity truly massive. And then I think it's good to have a conversation about these very elderly defendants. And yes, some of them may exercise agency in excessively looking unwell, but they're just unwell, biologically, physically at that time. And I think if we get away from these notions of perpetrators as broad and tall and powerful and strong at all times, I think we get away from those kinds of stereotypes. If we get away from those kinds of constructions, I think we then get a far deeper and better appreciation of how atrocity really happens and how power is never permanent, the shifting nature of power and its authority and exercise. I've written a lot about individuals who are both victims and victimizers. I'm very interested, for example, in World War II, in concentration camps, how a variety of individuals persecuted by the Nazis, brought into the concentration camps against their will. Also, 10% of those individuals came to form part of what the Nazis called prisoner self-administration. And many of the camps ran with very limited SS oversight. And a lot of the daily functions of law and order in the camps fell into the space of completely persecuted people who then became part of the machinery of persecution. And I think as international criminal lawyers, we need to develop a better vocabulary in law to talk about, in my opinion, the riddles of how the weak can be really strong in certain moments. How a powerless person can still lord tremendous authority, including over life and death, over someone else in a particular moment. And I guess what I would urge is that, courts exist, like Hannah Arendt said in Eichmann in Jerusalem, courts exist to determine the guilt or innocence of the man or the woman in the dock. But in the public at large, courts also themselves are vehicles for storytelling. They're seen by the public as places and spaces where not only stories are narrated, but life is unveiled and life cycles are shown. And to me, these cases this year, the three that I've picked to just share with you briefly, for me show how the weak can inflict terrible pain, how, in the case of child soldiering, the pain of child soldiering can last, be ongoing, and also, I think, a very important question when we also talk about life cycles, when it comes to forced marriage and compelled procreation. One of the really tough conversational questions is, what about the children born out of forced marriage relationships? How do we think about reintegrating those particular individuals? And on forced marriage, I'm writing an article now, and this will be the last thing that I end up on, because I think maybe we can have some dialogue. So I'm writing an article now on northern Uganda, and I'm writing it with an anthropologist. And it's on something that does not get spoken about much in northern Uganda, namely the men in the forced marriage relationships in the LRA. I mentioned to you earlier that in Cambodia, in terms of the judicialization of forced marriage, the men were presented as victims of forced marriage. Now, the ECCC, in the November 2018 judgment, did rule that the men in forced marriage relationships did not suffer rape in those particular forced marriage contexts. That was in part due to a read of Cambodian law. But then the court also ruled that the compelled procreation that the men in forced married relationships were subject to did not amount to sexual violence. It was not of the gravity of sexual violence. So despite the fact that men were seen as victims of the Khmer Rouge overall policy of forced marriage, there were limits to the victimhood of men in those relationships as articulated by the verdict, as articulated through law. Now, in northern Uganda, almost the entirety, or I would say the entirety, and please correct, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, almost the entirety of the presentation of victimhood in the forced marriage charges in the Ongwen case revolves around women and girls. And this is interesting to me because if one looks at the ethnographic research, if one looks at the on-the-ground scenarios and realities of forced marriage in northern Uganda, yes, there were some commanders, in particular more senior commanders like Ongwen, who took on multiple wives and who exercised choice. They exercised their choice in so doing. And that's the facts of Ongwen. I think he had 10 wives. You know, it's 5. 9. I'm off by one. Close enough. At least I got the 70 right. 9. So that's one thing. But what's extremely interesting is if you look more deeply at some of the ethnographic data, most of the men in forced marriage relationships in the LRA were ordered by commanders to be in those particular relationships. And it was not structured the way the Khmer Rouge did so, but I think a fuller vision of the crime of forced marriage in northern Uganda must tell the story of the horrific sexual torture against women within those frameworks. But there is also a story in northern Uganda how a number of men and boys also suffered in forced marriage contexts. Certainly in the nature of the crime of forced marriage, if one of its key elements is a crushing of the freedom of association, a crushing of dignity, and a removal of choice in the context of one of the most personal and private decisions that may be made, that of marriage, which is, of course, framed as such all the way back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So all this to say that when I think of a year in review, I learn from panels about prosecutors that involve discussing what's going on, but I think one of the most interesting things for international criminal law and its adjudication is the broader storytelling capacity. What stories does law tell? Does law tell complete stories? Does law tell partial stories? Does law occlude as it clarifies? Does law take away as it gives? And to me, on a broader level, if we believe in the value of international prosecutions, which we all do, I also think we need to think about how to tell those stories. And for law to better tell those stories, I think, and to tell them more completely, I think will do us all justice in terms of our own endeavors. So that's my year in review comment.